The group of animals that we're going to be talking about today is unusual in several respects. First of all, they have their mouth, which is also their anus, in the middle of the underside of the body, like where your belly button is. And secondly, they're hermaphrodites, so they have both male and female sex organs. But when two individuals meet, they all want to be the male, and so they try and stab one another with their penises. That's an activity called penis fencing. Any idea what this group of animals is? Just keep watching. So the animals I'm talking about are flatworms. Now, flatworms are different from the segmented worms, the earthworms and the polychaete worms. They're not segmented, and they have, surprisingly, a very flat body. So they look a little bit like the leaf of a tree, very, very flat and thin. It's quite fascinating watching a flatworm move around. Most of them move using a bed of tiny little hairs on the underside called cilia, and they're the same things that we use in our nose and our throat to move the mucus around it. They're little projections from the cells. And then these cilia just are moving all the time, and then it's just, the worm just cruises, just slides along without really changing its body shape. Some of the larger species, though, are quite muscular, and they have ripples of muscular movement along the margins of the foot. And in fact, some of them are very good swimmers, so if you disturb one, or if it just suddenly decides to let go and set off to find a new spot, then it swims with quite a graceful pulsing motion of the edges of its foot.
Sort of looks like somebody moving their skirt in the wind or something.
Yes, it's a little bit like the Spanish dancers, the nudibranchs, the big flat nudibranchs. So it has this very elegant flapping movement of the margins of its foot, and it can swim really quite well. So they glide along, and then they glide over their prey. They're all predatory, so they feed on little crustaceans and mollusks. They glide over their prey, and then they engulf it with the mouth, which is in the middle of the underside. And then the food goes into some blind ending gut tubes, and then the waste comes back out the same hole again. Oh, excuse you, Ben. You're thinking about food.
Ben being a treat fiend again. Bribery and corruption will work every time.
So the most interesting aspect of flatworms is their mode of reproduction. They're all hermaphrodites, so they have both male and female sex organs. So when any two meet, then they can be friends, they can mate with one another. But the interesting thing here is it's much more costly to take on the female role than to take on the male role. The male just inseminates the female, and then he can just wander off and inseminate other individuals. But if you take on the female role, then you have to grow the eggs and look after the babies. So neither of them wants to be the female, and so they fight about this. And the way that they settle this is that they undertake an activity that's called penis fencing. So each one tries to stab the other through the body wall with its penis. As soon as the one manages to jab the other and inject his sperm, then he rushes off and looks for another mate. The one that's been jabbed, though, has to now grow the eggs and then lay the egg mass. And that egg mass then hatches into more tiny little flatworms.
I've seen a couple of them have the two little horns on top. Are those like rhinophores? Are they smelling the water?
They're little sensory antennae. So these are the most primitive animals to actually have kind of a head with sensory organs on it. And there isn't much, but they often two little antennae that poke out, and sometimes a little primitive eye. So there are quite a few species of flatworm that we get in South Africa, and they tend to be more diverse in the tropics and less diverse in the more temperate parts of the country. So in the more tropical region, you'll find very many very flamboyant, brightly colored and fairly large flatworms. And interestingly, some of them actually mimic sea slugs or nudibranchs, because most nudibranchs are toxic, and by looking the same and having the same color pattern as the nudibranch, they can gain protection because predators think, oh, that's also a bad tasting thing. In the cooler parts of the country, the species that we get tend to be slightly more drably coloured. But there is one very pretty one in the Western Cape here, which is called the carpet flatworm. And it's unusual among flatworms in that it's not completely flat. There's always an exception to every rule. On its dorsal surface, on its back, it has little projections like the pile of a carpet.
Like a shag rug.
It's a shaggy flatworm, yeah. But it's very pretty. We don't know too much about it. It's usually found under rocks, and we presume that it feeds on small crustaceans. But the most common flatworm in the cooler parts of the country is one that lives commensally with limpets. And almost every one of these large limpets actually has one or more of these flatworms living in its gill cavity. So if you take a large limpet off the rocks and look at its underside, then you'll very often see these speckledy brown flatworms living in the groove around the foot of the limpet where its gills are. We think that they're gaining protection by being under the limpet, so they benefit, and they feed on small copepods that live in the gill cavity of the limpet, and maybe that helps the limpet.
Sort of like a oxpecker on the back of a zebra or
Yes,
something.
it's a little bit like oxpeckers removing the parasites from the antelope or buffalo.
Didn't you once say that you have a flatworm named after you, like a parasitic flatworm from the stomach of a suckerfish or something?
Yes, that was one of my students was working on suckerfish, and we discovered this parasitic flatworm in its gut, and I sent it to a taxonomist in Europe, and he described it after me. But I don't know that it's the species named after me that I'm most proud of, being associated with being a parasitic flatworm from the stomach of a suckerfish. Not the most romantic. I haven't got it framed on my mantelpiece.
It's not on your wall.
Oh, they're going to have a lie down. There's my boy. Gonna have a nice swim. Hey, there's my boy. Good dog. Nice swimmy.